The first time I heard my own name crackle over a police radio as an alleged violent suspect, I was standing in my driveway holding a mug of coffee watching an HOA Karen point at me like she had just discovered a wanted criminal, and that was the moment my entire morning snapped into slow motion, because 10 seconds earlier she had been screaming into her phone claiming I attacked her, and now red and blue lights were already turning the corner of our quiet street, and if that does not grab your attention, then imagine this: she was smiling while she did it, absolutely convinced that this was her winning move, that she had finally found the nuclear option to crush me and force me into compliance. And I remember thinking how dangerous it is when someone believes power belongs to them just because they are loud enough to demand it. It had started like most neighborhood nightmares do, with something so small it felt almost silly to get worked up over, but that is how entitlement grows roots and wraps itself around everything until it strangles common sense, because Karen had decided that my driveway violated an HOA rule she could never quite produce in writing, and when I calmly asked her to show me the clause, she pivoted to tone, then threats, then authority, and finally to victimhood, all in the span of 5 minutes. She was in her mid-40s, immaculate outfit, hair perfectly sprayed, clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield, and she had that look people get when they think rules exist only to serve them, and everyone else exists only to obey. And when I refused to move my truck from my own driveway, she leaned closer and lowered her voice and said, "You are making a big mistake," as if she were offering me one last mercy before pressing a button. I had seen this type before: people who think escalation equals strength, and who confuse attention with legitimacy, and I tried once more to de-escalate, telling her there was no need for drama, that we could talk it through with the HOA board later, but she laughed, actually laughed, and stepped back, dialing her phone, and announcing loudly for the neighbors to hear that she was calling the police because she felt threatened. I did not raise my voice, I did not move toward her, I did not even take another sip of coffee, but suddenly she was describing an attack that never happened, claiming I lunged at her, shoved her, screamed in her face, and the performance was so theatrical that one of the neighbors peeked through their blinds and immediately ducked back inside like this was a live grenade. As she talked, her expression shifted from fake fear to smug satisfaction, because she knew exactly what she was doing, and she believed without question that the system would bend to her narrative simply because she spoke first and loudest, and that belief was the truly terrifying part. When she hung up, she folded her arms and told me to enjoy jail, and for a brief moment I wondered how many times she had done this before, how many people she had bullied into submission by threatening to weaponize authority against them, and how many had folded because the idea of flashing lights and handcuffs is enough to make anyone second-guess their own innocence. The sound of sirens grew closer, and she straightened her posture, practiced her trembling voice, and positioned herself so the arriving officers would see her first, and I could not help but feel a strange mix of anger, amusement, and sadness, because she had no idea how badly she had miscalculated, not because I was special or powerful in that moment, but because truth has a way of waiting patiently while lies sprint ahead and trip over themselves. The first patrol car rolled in, followed by a second, and suddenly the street felt smaller, tighter, like all the air had been sucked out, and Karen rushed forward, sobbing, pointing back at me, claiming she feared for her life, and the officers listened professionally, eyes moving from her to me, to the driveway, to the neighbors, pretending not to watch, and I noticed little things: the way one officer glanced at my truck, the way another scanned the scene looking for signs of a struggle that did not exist. And I could see the confusion flicker because reality did not match the story. I stayed still, hands visible, calm voice, because I knew that panic feeds narratives like hers, and while I was not ready to reveal anything yet, I was very aware of how quickly situations like this can spiral when someone is desperate to be right. As they separated us, Karen grew louder, insisting I be arrested immediately, demanding charges, accusing the officers of not taking her seriously, and that was when the dispatcher crackled back through one of the radios asking for clarification on the alleged assault details, and the silence that followed was thick, because Karen had embellished herself into a corner. She started adding details, inventing injuries, pointing at her arm, claiming pain where there was no mark, and I watched the officers exchange a look that said everything, because false reports leave fingerprints even before the paperwork starts. In that moment I felt the weight of responsibility not just for myself but for the system she was abusing, because every false call delays a real one, every lie risks someone else not being believed, and while Karen saw this as a personal victory, I saw it as something much uglier, a test of whether authority bends to volume or to truth. As the officers began asking me my side of the story, I answered simply, calmly explaining the dispute, the threats, the call, and the fact that no physical contact ever occurred, and as I spoke I could feel the tide shifting, not dramatically, not yet, but steadily, and Karen sensed it too, because her confidence wavered just enough for fear to slip through the cracks, and for the first time she realized this might not end the way she rehearsed. She tried one last push, stepping forward, raising her voice, accusing me again, but one of the officers gently held up a hand and told her to take a breath, and that small gesture was the first crack in her illusion of control, and standing there with sirens fading and neighbors watching, I knew this was only the beginning, because a false accusation does not disappear once spoken, it demands consequences one way or another, and as Karen continued digging herself deeper, I quietly prepared for the moment when she would learn that power is not something you claim, it is something you are trusted with, and she had just proven she could not be trusted at all. The officers separated us further, and the street settled into an uneasy quiet that felt heavier than the sirens ever did, because now there was time for reality to catch up, and Karen did not like that at all as she paced near the sidewalk, arms flailing every few seconds as if motion alone could keep her story alive, while I stood near my truck answering questions in a steady voice and watching the small details pile up against her like sandbags against a flood. One officer asked me to walk through exactly what happened from the moment she arrived, and I did, starting with the clipboard, the demand, the non-existent rule, and the sudden jump to threats, and I could see the other officer taking notes, occasionally glancing up at Karen, whose version kept shifting as she tried to match whatever she overheard me saying, and that was when the cracks widened, because consistency is not something you can fake for long. She claimed again that I had rushed at her but could not say how far I moved or where I supposedly stood when it happened, and when asked why no neighbor had witnessed it, she accused everyone else of hiding or being complicit, which earned her a look that said this was not helping her case. The officers asked if there were any cameras nearby, and I casually mentioned the security camera mounted above my garage pointing directly at the driveway, and Karen froze just long enough for anyone paying attention to notice before she recovered and insisted cameras can be edited, which only made the air feel tighter around her. One officer asked if I would be willing to show the footage, and I nodded without hesitation, because the truth does not panic, and as we walked toward the house Karen followed closely, still talking, still trying to control the narrative, claiming the camera angle would not show everything, and that she knew the law, and that people like me always get away with things, which was an interesting choice of words considering nothing had happened. Inside the house the footage played, clearly showing her arrival, her aggressive posture, her pointing finger, and her phone call complete with dramatic gestures and exaggerated recoil, when I simply shifted my weight, and when the video reached the moment she claimed the assault occurred, there was nothing, just me standing still holding my mug, and her stepping backward on her own, and the silence that followed was loud. The officers watched it twice, not because they doubted what they saw, but because procedure demands certainty, and Karen watched too, her face flushing deeper with each passing second, until she finally snapped that it was out of context and demanded they turn it off, and at that point the performance unraveled completely, because when lies are exposed they rarely retreat quietly. The officer closest to her calmly explained that making a false report is a serious matter, and that using emergency services as a weapon carries consequences, and Karen laughed nervously, insisting it was all a misunderstanding, and that she only called because she felt unsafe, which did not align with the footage of her smirking and pointing while dialing, and for the first time she looked at me not with rage but with suspicion, as if she were starting to sense there was more to me than she assumed. Outside the neighbors were more visible now, whispers traveling faster than facts, and I could see Karen clocking every stare, every phone raised slightly too high, and the shift in public perception rattled her, because people like her rely on social pressure as much as authority, and both were slipping away. The officers returned to their patrol cars briefly to consult with dispatch, and I heard fragments of conversation through the open window, words like unfounded and documentation and warning, and Karen hovered near them trying to insert herself only to be asked politely to step back, which she did reluctantly, still convinced she could talk her way out if she just kept going. When the officers returned, one of them explained that based on the evidence there was no assault and that her call was being recorded as a false report pending further review, and that alone was enough to make her voice jump an octave as she accused them of siding with me and threatened to contact their supervisors and the mayor and anyone else she could think of, because to her accountability always looks like persecution. I remained quiet because sometimes the smartest move is to let someone keep talking until they say something that cannot be walked back, and she did exactly that, ranting about how people like her should not be questioned and how rules exist for a reason and how she would make sure this did not end here, and with every word she handed the officers more reasons to take this seriously. One officer finally told her to stop and listen and explained slowly that she was being issued a warning for misuse of emergency services and that any further action would be handled through proper channels, and that set her off because warnings are not victories, and she stormed away shouting that the HOA would hear about this and that I was not as untouchable as I thought, and as she disappeared down the sidewalk still muttering, I felt the odd calm that comes after a near miss when adrenaline drains away and leaves clarity behind. The officers turned to me then and thanked me for my cooperation and told me to document everything because situations like this tend to escalate before they resolve, and I assured them I would, and as they drove off and the street returned to its usual quiet, I knew with absolute certainty that this was far from over, because Karen did not just lose a confrontation, she lost face, and people like her do not forgive that they double down, and I had a feeling the next move would be bigger, louder, and far more desperate than a driveway dispute ever should be. The fallout did not take long to arrive because entitlement hates silence, and within 24 hours Karen found a new stage to perform on, and this time it was the HOA itself which she mobilized like a private army, sending emails, texts, and emergency meeting notices that framed her as a victim of intimidation and me as a dangerous presence in the neighborhood, and by the time I woke up the next morning my phone was already buzzing with forwarded messages and thinly veiled warnings from board members who suddenly remembered rules they had ignored for years. She claimed I had threatened her position, undermined the authority of the HOA, and created an unsafe environment, and it was fascinating how quickly the narrative shifted from a supposed assault to a broader crusade about order and compliance, because when one lie fails another takes its place and grows larger to compensate. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for that evening, and the language used was dramatic enough to suggest a hurricane warning rather than a driveway disagreement, and when I arrived the room was already charged with tension, neighbors whispering, Karen sitting front and center with a stack of papers arranged carefully like props, and board members looking uncomfortable but eager to regain control of something they never truly had. She launched into her account, immediately painting herself as a public servant attacked for doing her duty, claiming the police failed her, and that only decisive HOA action could prevent future incidents, and she spoke with the confidence of someone who believed volume equals truth. I listened quietly, letting her talk, because every exaggeration widened the gap between reality and her version, and when she finally paused expecting applause, she was met with uneasy silence, and that rattled her because silence is harder to fight than opposition. When it was my turn, I did not accuse or insult, I simply described the events calmly, and offered to share the footage again, and the mere mention of evidence caused a ripple through the room, because Karen had not told them about the camera or the warning she received for the false report. Board members exchanged looks, realizing they were missing key facts, and Karen interrupted repeatedly, trying to redirect, accusing me of intimidation tactics, and that was when one member asked a simple question that shifted everything, asking whether the police had found any evidence of an assault, and Karen hesitated just long enough to answer vaguely, which was answer enough. The meeting devolved quickly from order into damage control as the board realized they were being asked to enforce discipline based on a claim already dismissed by law enforcement, and Karen reacted poorly, raising her voice, accusing the board of betrayal, and threatening to take the issue public, which was ironic given how quickly public scrutiny would unravel her story. After the meeting ended, she cornered me in the parking lot, insisting this was not over, and that she had friends in high places, and that she would make sure I regretted embarrassing her, and I remember looking at her, and feeling not fear but a kind of weary curiosity, because she was still playing a game whose rules she did not understand. Over the next few days, complaints appeared like clockwork, formal letters about noise, about parking, about property lines, all clearly orchestrated, and all designed to provoke a reaction, and I documented everything, responding politely and thoroughly, because the paper trail matters, and each response tightened the net she was weaving around herself. The HOA sent inspectors who found nothing, and Karen escalated again, contacting county offices, filing reports, and claiming harassment, and I could sense the frustration growing on the other end of those calls as clerks and officials realized they were being dragged into a personal vendetta dressed up as civic concern. The tipping point came when she attempted to file another police report, this time claiming ongoing intimidation, and that was when patience finally ran out, because patterns are impossible to ignore once they form, and dispatch flagged the call, noting the prior incident, and the officers who responded recognized the address and the name, and that recognition carries weight. I watched from my porch as she argued with them again, her voice rising as she demanded action, and when they explained that repeated unfounded reports could lead to charges, she accused them of conspiracy and favoritism, and I could see the moment when her confidence finally cracked, because the script she relied on was no longer working. That evening I received a call asking me to come down to the station to provide additional documentation, and I went willingly, knowing that clarity thrives in daylight, and as I walked through those familiar halls, I felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing exactly how this would play out, not because I sought revenge, but because systems, when used properly, have a way of correcting abuse. Karen, on the other hand, was spiraling, sending frantic messages, rallying allies who began to distance themselves as the truth became harder to ignore, and by the end of the week, the HOA board issued a notice distancing itself from her actions and advising residents to route disputes through proper channels, which was their way of backing away slowly from a fire they nearly stepped into. She did not take that well, and in her desperation she made the one mistake that would change everything by filing a formal complaint against me with the county, accusing me of corruption and misuse of authority, unaware of how closely those words would be examined and how thoroughly they would be answered, because when you accuse the system itself you invite it to look back at you, and as I read the complaint, calmly noting the inconsistencies and outright fabrications, I knew we were approaching the moment when the truth would no longer be optional, and Karen would learn that power borrowed through noise collapses the instant it is tested against reality. The complaint she filed triggered a chain reaction that she never anticipated, because once paperwork crosses from public noise into formal review, it stops being theater and becomes methodical, and the county takes accusations seriously regardless of who they are aimed at, which meant investigators began doing what Karen had never done herself: verifying timelines, checking recordings, pulling call logs, and interviewing witnesses, and that process has a way of stripping stories down to their bones. I was asked to provide statements, copies of footage, emails, HOA notices, and logs of every interaction, and I did so calmly, knowing that accuracy favors patience, and while Karen told anyone who would listen that she had finally forced accountability, what she had really done was invite scrutiny into every move she had made over the past week. Investigators visited the neighborhood, quietly speaking with neighbors who had watched events unfold from their windows and porches, and it did not take long for a consistent picture to emerge, one of aggressive confrontations, shifting claims, and repeated attempts to involve authorities without evidence, and when people are asked simple questions in calm rooms, the truth tends to surface naturally. Karen sensed the shift and tried to regain control by flooding inboxes with follow-up emails, addendums, and dramatic clarifications, each one contradicting the last, and each one becoming another exhibit, and the more she wrote the worse it looked, because emotional urgency does not translate into factual consistency. The HOA board began distancing themselves more openly, issuing a notice reminding residents about proper dispute resolution and clarifying that individual members do not speak for the association, and that was a public step back that cut deeply because Karen had built her identity around being the voice of authority, and now that voice was being gently but firmly muted. She responded by holding an impromptu gathering on her lawn, rallying a handful of loyalists, who listened politely but avoided eye contact, and as the crowd thinned she grew sharper, more accusatory, blaming me, the board, the police, and the county for what she called a coordinated effort to silence her, and I watched from a distance, noting how isolation fuels desperation. The investigators requested a follow-up interview with her, and from what I later learned it did not go as she expected because they asked straightforward questions about date statements and motivations, and she answered with speeches about respect and entitlement and how rules must be enforced, and that mismatch mattered because investigators look for facts, not feelings. Meanwhile, dispatch records showed the pattern of calls, the escalation language, and the lack of corroboration, and body camera footage from responding officers captured demeanor and contradictions in real time, and when placed side by side with my footage, the narrative collapsed into fragments that could not be reassembled into something credible. At this stage I was advised to remain neutral and let the process work, and that advice was sound because the more space Karen was given, the more she revealed her own instability, and the county does not rush, but it does not forget either. A notice arrived scheduling a formal review hearing, and suddenly the stakes felt real to her, not as a performance but as potential consequences, and she began reaching out, attempting to negotiate, suggesting misunderstandings, mutual apologies, and private resolutions, which was a stark reversal from her earlier certainty, and it confirmed what pressure reveals priorities. I declined to engage directly and referred everything through proper channels, which frustrated her further because she thrived on personal confrontation, and without it she had nothing to feed on. The day of the hearing the room was quiet, professional, and procedural, and Karen arrived with a binder thicker than necessary full of printed emails, highlighted phrases, and handwritten notes that reflected emotion rather than evidence, and when asked to present her case she spoke at length, circling back repeatedly to feelings of disrespect and fear and authority, and when pressed for specifics she deflected and grew defensive. The panel listened patiently, then reviewed the documentation, timelines, footage, and testimony, and the contrast was stark because truth does not need embellishment. When questions turned to the false report, the misuse of emergency services, and the pattern of harassment, the room grew still, and Karen shifted in her seat, realizing that the spotlight had moved and was not moving back. She attempted one last pivot, accusing me again of influence and favoritism, and that accusation landed flat, because process had been followed transparently step by step, and accusations without proof only underscore weakness. By the end of the session it was clear that findings would not favor her, and the chair explained next steps in a measured tone, outlining potential consequences and required actions, and as those words settled, the bravado drained from her posture, replaced by a tight, brittle anger that could not find a target. Outside the room she confronted me, briefly demanding to know who I really was and why this was happening to her, and I answered calmly that it was happening because actions have consequences, and that was the only explanation she was ever going to get. As she walked away muttering, I felt no triumph, only relief, because accountability is not about winning, it is about restoring balance, and as the county continued its review, the narrative that once relied on volume had been reduced to a file number and a set of facts, and that transformation marked the turning point where drama gave way to resolution, and where Karen learned that systems built on evidence are immune to tantrums no matter how loudly they are thrown. The waiting period after the hearing was the most revealing phase, because when there is no audience left to impress, people are forced to sit with their own actions, and Karen did not handle that well at all. As days passed without immediate vindication, she began unraveling in small public ways, sharp comments at neighbors, passive-aggressive posts, online vague accusations about corruption and favoritism, all of which were quietly noted and archived by people who had grown tired of being dragged into her storms. The county moved, deliberately requesting supplemental materials, cross-checking statements, and finalizing findings, and while that process unfolded, Karen attempted to regain relevance by staging confrontations near the mailbox or during evening walks, hoping to provoke a reaction she could frame as further evidence, and each time I responded with nothing more than a nod or silence, because engagement was the fuel she craved and denial starved the fire. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now lingered to talk, sharing stories of their own encounters with her over the years, and it became clear that this was not an isolated incident but a pattern that had finally reached a breaking point, and the collective relief was palpable as people realized they were not alone and never had been. The HOA board took another decisive step, issuing formal guidance limiting the authority of individual members and mandating mediation for disputes, which was their way of acknowledging past failures without admitting them outright, and Karen reacted by resigning in a dramatic email that accused everyone of betrayal and vowed consequences that never materialized. Without an official platform, her voice lost reach, and that loss of control hit harder than any formal reprimand, because power for her had always been performative, and without a stage the performance collapsed. The county findings arrived in writing, concise, unemotional, and thorough, concluding that the assault allegation was unfounded, that emergency services had been misused, and that there was a documented pattern of harassment and escalation, and the consequences outlined were measured but firm: mandatory education on appropriate use of emergency services, a formal warning placed on record, and clear notice that further violations would result in charges and fines. And while it was not the dramatic downfall some might expect, it was exactly what accountability looks like in reality. Karen received the notice, and for the first time there was no immediate outburst, no public rant, just a closed door and drawn blinds, and the quiet was telling, because people who thrive on conflict do not retreat unless the ground beneath them has shifted permanently. In the following weeks, life began to normalize. The street felt lighter, conversations resumed, children played outside without parents glancing nervously toward one particular house, and the absence of chaos highlighted how much space it had occupied before. Karen emerged, occasionally avoiding eye contact, keeping interactions brief and transactional, and while there were moments where old habits threatened to resurface, they fizzled quickly, without reinforcement, and the system held firm. I was asked once more to provide a final acknowledgement that the matter had been resolved, and I did, because closure matters not just legally but communally, and that signature marked the end of the official chapter, even as the personal lessons lingered. Looking back, it was clear that none of this had been about a driveway or a rule, or even authority. It had been about control, and the belief that shouting louder could bend reality, and that belief had finally been corrected, not through confrontation but through process. The irony was that the system Karen tried to weaponize was the same one that protected her rights even as it restrained her behavior, and that balance is the quiet strength of institutions when they function as intended. There was no victory lap, no speech, just a return to ordinary days, and that ordinariness felt earned, because peace is often the most satisfying outcome of all. As weeks turned into months, the story became just another cautionary tale shared quietly when new neighbors moved in, a reminder that power is not something you claim through fear, and that false accusations carry real weight even when they fail. Karen faded into the background, a presence rather than a force, and while I did not wish her harm, I hoped she learned that accountability is not an attack but an invitation to change, and whether she accepted that invitation was beyond my control. What mattered was that the line had been drawn clearly, and that for everyone involved the lesson was unmistakable: systems reward patience, facts outlast noise, and when entitlement meets evidence it always loses eventually and quietly. And for the first time since that morning with the coffee mug and the sirens, I could stand in my driveway, breathe easily, and trust that calm had finally reclaimed its place. The calm that followed felt earned, but it was also fragile, because unresolved curiosity has a way of pulling threads, and it did not take long before whispers started circulating about why the county response had been so thorough, and why certain lines Karen tried to cross had stopped her cold, and those questions eventually found their way to me during a quiet evening conversation with a neighbor, who asked gently how I stayed so composed through everything and whether I had some kind of legal background, and I realized then that the final piece of truth had been hovering long enough. I did not announce it publicly or dramatically because real authority does not require a spotlight, but when asked directly I answered honestly, explaining that my role in the county was not incidental and that I had spent years working within the same system Karen tried to manipulate, and that experience taught me when to speak and when to let process do its job. Word travels fast in small communities, and by the next day the tone of interactions had shifted from curiosity to understanding, because people recalibrate their assumptions once they know who is standing in front of them and why certain lines are not to be crossed. Karen learned the same way, not through gossip but through official confirmation, when a routine notice referenced my position in passing, and the effect was immediate, because her posture changed overnight from defiance to guarded compliance, and it was clear that what frightened her was not me personally, but the realization that she had aimed false accusations directly at the very system she depended on to protect her. That knowledge carried weight not as a threat but as a mirror showing her actions reflected back without distortion, and for someone who had relied on intimidation, the loss of leverage was profound. The county took one additional step, issuing a community-wide reminder about appropriate use of emergency services and the legal consequences of false reports, and while it was framed as general education, everyone knew why it existed, and the message landed, because it was factual, calm, and unavoidable. I was careful to maintain distance and professionalism because the goal was never to humiliate but to stabilize, and that distinction matters when authority is involved. Over the following weeks, Karen kept to herself, attending mandatory sessions, complying with directives, and avoiding situations that could be misinterpreted, and while there were moments where old impulses surfaced, they were quickly contained, because the boundaries were now unmistakable. Neighbors noticed the change, and conversations shifted from recounting incidents to discussing improvements, block events, shared maintenance plans, simple things that flourish when tension recedes, and the HOA restructured its processes, adding transparency and checks that should have existed all along, and that institutional correction was perhaps the most meaningful outcome because it reduced the likelihood of anyone else trying the same tactics again. I reflected often on how close this situation came to spiraling, and how easily a false accusation can upend lives if not handled carefully, and that awareness reinforced why restraint matters, especially for those of us entrusted with authority. Being the county sheriff is not about control or dominance, it is about stewardship and ensuring systems serve truth rather than ego, and in that sense this incident became a case study in how abuse of process is best addressed, not with retaliation but with clarity, documentation, and patience. Karen never apologized directly, and that was fine because accountability does not require contrition to function, and over time her presence became just another house on the street, no longer a focal point, and that normalization was the quiet confirmation that balance had been restored. When I stood in my driveway again months later, coffee in hand, the memory of sirens felt distant, replaced by the ordinary sounds of a neighborhood at ease, and I knew that revealing my role had not been a trump card, but a final calibration, aligning perception with reality, and closing the loop on a story that began with noise and ended with understanding. The lesson was not that power should be hidden or flaunted, but that it should be exercised sparingly and transparently, and that when people misuse systems designed to protect, they ultimately expose themselves, and the system corrects course not with spectacle but with resolve. In the end, Karen learned that calling 911 is not a shortcut to authority, and that false claims leave footprints that cannot be erased, and the community learned that calm persistence outlasts intimidation, and for me it reaffirmed why trust is earned through consistency, not volume, and why the quiet moments after a storm are often the most instructive of all. What surprised me most as time went on was not how quickly the neighborhood healed, but how deeply the incident lingered in subtle ways, because once people witness authority being tested and corrected, they start to notice patterns they once ignored, and conversations became more thoughtful, less reactive, and grounded in facts rather than rumors, and that shift mattered because it meant the community had matured through discomfort. Karen still lived there, still walked the same sidewalks, still checked the same mail, but she moved through the space differently now, with caution replacing entitlement and restraint replacing confrontation, and while some might call that defeat, I saw it as recalibration, because unchecked confidence had finally met consequence. There were moments when she tried to test boundaries, small comments about rules or side glances meant to provoke, but without an audience or institutional backing they dissolved quickly, and she seemed to understand that escalation would only revive scrutiny she could no longer withstand. The HOA board continued its reforms, implementing written procedures, documented complaint handling, and mandatory verification before action, and those changes quietly prevented several minor disputes from turning into spectacles, and neighbors noticed how much calmer meetings felt when rules were applied evenly and without theatrics. I remained intentionally low profile, attending meetings only when necessary and speaking rarely, because leadership is not measured by airtime, and the less I said the more effective the process became. Occasionally someone would thank me privately, not for the outcome but for the restraint, and that acknowledgement mattered because it reflected an understanding that strength does not always announce itself loudly. Karen on her part attempted once to approach me directly months later, perhaps seeking closure or validation, but the conversation stayed brief, polite, and factual, and she avoided revisiting the past, which told me she had finally accepted that the narrative she once controlled no longer belonged to her. The county followed up to ensure compliance, and found none of the red flags that once flared so brightly, and with that the file closed quietly and permanently, and that closure was important because it signaled trust restored, not through forgetting, but through accountability satisfied. Life resumed its rhythms, seasonal changes, block gatherings, routine inconveniences, and in that normalcy the earlier chaos felt almost surreal, like a cautionary story you tell to remind yourself how fragile peace can be when ego goes unchecked. I often thought about how easily that first morning could have gone differently, how a raised voice, a defensive gesture, or a moment of impatience could have validated her claims and altered the trajectory entirely, and that awareness reinforced the importance of composure, especially for those entrusted with authority, because the margin between justice and injustice can be as thin as a single reaction. Karen never regained the influence she once wielded, and perhaps that was the most fitting consequence, because influence untempered by responsibility becomes dangerous, and its loss forces reflection, whether welcome or not. Neighbors who once felt intimidated found their voices returning, sharing concerns openly, knowing there were now safeguards, and that empowerment strengthened the community more than any punishment ever could. As for me, the experience reaffirmed why systems exist, and why they must be defended from misuse, not by bending them to personal ends but by insisting on their integrity, even when it is inconvenient. The temptation to reveal my position earlier, to shut everything down, had been strong, but doing so would have taught the wrong lesson, suggesting that authority resolves conflict by declaration rather than process, and allowing the system to work without shortcuts preserved its legitimacy for everyone involved. Karen learned that falsehoods leave trails that do not disappear, and that emergency services are not tools for personal battles, and while that lesson came at a cost, it was one she alone incurred through choice. The neighborhood learned that collective calm and documentation are powerful shields against intimidation, and that lessons spread quietly but effectively. When I look back now, the most striking aspect is how ordinary the ending feels, because true resolution rarely arrives with applause. It settles in quietly changing behavior, restoring balance, and allowing people to move on wiser than before. Standing on my porch one evening watching the sun dip below rooftops, I felt a sense of closure, not because someone lost, but because a line had been drawn clearly and held firmly, and that clarity is what keeps communities intact long after the drama fades into memory. The final clarity came not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a quiet understanding that settled over the neighborhood like a restored rhythm, and that felt appropriate because the entire ordeal had always been about misuse of noise rather than absence of truth, and now truth had reclaimed its place without needing to shout. Karen continued living her life within newly understood boundaries, and while she never became warm or friendly, she became predictable, and that predictability was enough because safety in a community often begins with knowing what to expect rather than fearing sudden escalation. The HOA functioned with new guardrails and accountability measures that outlived the controversy, and in meetings there was a noticeable shift toward facts documentation and measured discussion, and even disagreements unfolded without theatrics because people had seen where unchecked emotion lead. I remained present but unobtrusive, offering guidance only when requested and trusting the structure to hold, because the goal was never to be the solution but to ensure one existed beyond any single person. Over time, new neighbors moved in unaware of the full story, yet benefiting from the calm it created, and that anonymity was a success in itself, because stability should not require constant reminders of past conflict. Occasionally someone would reference the incident obliquely as a lesson about calling authorities responsibly or documenting interactions, and those moments reinforced that experience had translated into wisdom rather than bitterness. For me, the episode crystallized why restraint matters and why authority must be exercised with humility, because power without humility invites abuse, and humility without firmness invites chaos, and the balance between the two is where trust lives. Karen never tested that balance again, and whether that came from learning fear or simple fatigue did not matter, because the outcome was the same: a community returned to equilibrium and a system reaffirmed in its purpose. As months turned into a year, the memory softened, edges blunted, and what remained was a narrative about accountability functioning as intended, not to punish excessively, but to correct behavior and protect the broader good. Standing in my driveway again on a quiet morning, I noticed how ordinary everything felt: birds, traffic, distant conversation, and that ordinariness was the real resolution, because peace does not announce itself, it simply exists once conditions allow. I reflected on how easily false accusations can ripple outward, harming not just targets but the credibility of institutions, and the importance of addressing them with seriousness and care, because dismissiveness breeds resentment while overreaction breeds fear, and neither serves justice. The lesson for everyone involved was simple yet profound: systems are strongest when they are boring, consistent, and fair, and when individuals attempt to weaponize them, they expose their own fragility. Karen faded into the background of daily life, not erased but integrated, and the community moved forward, carrying forward improved practices rather than grudges. I did not feel victorious or vindicated, only affirmed in the belief that patience, clarity, and adherence to process outlast manipulation every time. The experience reinforced my commitment to stewardship, to protecting the integrity of systems so they serve truth rather than ego, and to modeling the calm I hope others will choose when tensions rise. In the end, the story closed not with sirens or shouts, but with a shared understanding that authority is not a toy, that accountability is not optional, and that communities thrive when facts are allowed to speak louder than fear, and that was more than enough.